Just before dawn on May 29, 1453, the last emperor of Rome is standing on the walls of his city, looking at 60,000 torches. Behind him, ships are still waiting in the harbor. In front of him, an army is preparing to erase what remains of a 1,500-year empire. He can leave. He can surrender. He can live. In a few hours, he will choose none of those things. The man is Constantine XI, Constantine. And he is not Emperor of Rome, the city. He is Emperor of Rome, the empire. The same political entity Julius Caesar served, the same one that built the Colosseum, conquered Britain, and crucified Christ. By his title and by his blood, the line runs unbroken from Augustus all the way down to him. 1,500 years of Roman emperors, and then him. He is 49 years old. In a few hours, the empire will end. What's strange, what no one quite explains, is that he did not have to be standing there. A week earlier, the Sultan camped outside his walls had sent him a formal offer. Surrender the city. Walk out alive. Keep your imperial title in exile. Take a province in southern Greece, the way deposed Byzantine emperors had been doing for centuries. Spare your soldiers, your family, your court. The whole city would be spared the standard 3 days of pillage that follow a stormed assault. Ottoman tradition would be set aside. He could simply leave. In the harbor below him that night, 3 Genoese galleons were still in the water with their crews aboard. They would cut their anchors and sail at the first sign of collapse. One nod from him, and he was on one of them, sailing west to a long, comfortable retirement in an Italian villa. He said no. Not just no. He sent the Sultan a written reply in his own hand that said this: I do not have the authority to surrender Constantinople, because every person inside these walls has chosen of their own free will to die. This is the story of how a man with at least 2 clean ways out chose neither. Of what he did when the walls finally broke, and of what actually happened to him on the morning of May 29th. Because the truth, the part that gets quietly skipped in most retellings, is that after 1,000 years of unbroken Roman emperors, the last one disappears from the historical record entirely. We do not know who killed him. We do not know how he died. We do not know where his body is. To understand any of that, we have to go back 4 years. To the day a man was given a crown he never really had, in a city that was already half a ghost. The man on the walls had been emperor of the Romans for 4 years and 4 months. He was crowned on January 6, 1449, but not in Constantinople. That fact alone tells you most of what you need to know about the empire he inherited. A Roman emperor was supposed to be crowned in the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral of the medieval world, the most sacred space in the Orthodox Christian universe. For 900 years, every emperor had received the diadem from the hands of the patriarch under that dome. To skip the Hagia Sophia was to skip the entire ritual scaffolding that made an emperor an emperor. But Constantine could not go to the Hagia Sophia, because in 1449, Constantinople was on the edge of religious civil war. Years earlier, the previous emperor had signed a treaty with the Pope in Rome. In theory, the treaty ended the 400-year schism between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. In practice, it meant accepting Roman authority over the Orthodox Church, accepting a Latin Pope as the head of Greek Christianity. The Byzantine population was not having it. The reason was simple. Byzantine emperors had been begging the West for military aid for decades. The Pope's price was union, submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome. To the political class inside the palace, it was a survival deal, a price worth paying for the soldiers the West might send. To the priests and the common people in the streets, it was selling their souls for soldiers who had not even shown up yet. They said they would rather die free under their own god than live as subjects of a foreign one. So Constantine was crowned far from his capital in the small Greek city of Mistra. He arrived in Constantinople months later, not as a triumphant new emperor, but as a kind of acting manager, a man who knew his own people regarded his rule as half illegitimate from the day it began. That was the empire he had to defend. Now, the word empire here is generous. By 1449, what still called itself the Roman Empire was essentially one city, plus the Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece, plus a few outposts on the Black Sea. The city itself, Constantinople, once home to over 500,000 people at its medieval peak, had collapsed to about 50,000 residents. Inside the walls, the place looked like a ruin pretending to be a metropolis. Whole districts were empty. Citizens lived in small clusters, separated by overgrown fields, abandoned monasteries, and crumbling monuments. The Hagia Sophia still stood. The ancient aqueducts still worked. But a man walking across the city in the spring of 1449 would have passed through what looked less like a capital and more like a series of small towns scattered across farmland. What still made the place defensible was the wall. The Theodosian Walls were the most famous fortification in the medieval world, built 1,000 years earlier in 3 layers: an outer ditch, a low forward wall, and an inner main wall studded with 96 towers. They ran 14 miles across the landward peninsula. For 1,000 years, more than 20 armies had thrown themselves at those walls. Every one of them had failed. The walls were the reason no one had ever taken Constantinople by land. The walls were the reason an empire that had shrunk to a single city had survived as long as it had. The walls were the bet. 2 years into Constantine's reign, in February 1451, the bet stopped working. Across the Bosphorus Strait in the Ottoman capital, the old sultan died. His son inherited the throne. The new sultan was 19 years old. His name was Mehmed, the second Mehmed of his line. The chanceries of Europe took a look at him and quietly exhaled. A teenager, inexperienced, probably ineffective. The dispatches that went back to Venice and Rome and Buda all said variations of the same thing. This one will be easy to manage. They were wrong, and it would take them years to understand how wrong. What they did not see was that Mehmed II had been preparing for this since childhood. He had been briefly placed on the throne as a small boy, then deposed by his own father, a humiliation he never forgot. He spoke 5 languages. He had studied Caesar and Alexander, and in his head was a single image, a fortified city on the Bosphorus that no one had ever taken. The Ottomans called it the Red Apple, the ultimate prize, the legendary capital their dynasty had been circling for 100 years. He intended to be the one who finally bit it. For about a year, Mehmed performed the part European observers expected: polite diplomacy, renewed treaties, reassuring messages to Constantine in his own hand. Then, in April 1452, he started building a fortress. The fortress went up on the European bank of the Bosphorus, the narrow neck of water that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, directly across from an older Ottoman fort on the Asian side. Together, the 2 forts gave Mehmed something nobody had ever taken from Constantinople before: control of its supply route. This is the part that needs to land. Constantinople could not feed itself. Its grain came from the Black Sea coast, from the wheat fields of what is now Ukraine and Romania, shipped south through the narrow channel of the Bosphorus. If you closed the Bosphorus, you did not have to storm Constantinople. You could just wait for it to starve. The Ottoman fortress called Rumeli Hisari was completed in 4 months. 4 months. For comparison, the Byzantines had taken decades to build comparable works in their prime. Mehmed had 10,000 laborers and a deadline. In Constantinople, Constantine understood exactly what he was looking at. He sent envoys, he sent gifts, he asked Mehmed not to build it. The envoys came back empty-handed. One delegation was simply executed at the gate. The Byzantine emperor was watching, in real time, a noose tighten around his city, and he had no way to cut the rope. On November 10th, 1452, the noose proved itself. A Venetian merchant ship under a captain named Antonio Rizzo was running grain south from the Black Sea. He tried to slip past the new Ottoman guns at night. He did not make it. The cannon hit. The ship sank. The crew that survived was hauled ashore and executed. Except for the captain himself. Mehmed had him impaled on a stake by the side of the road, where every European trader heading north for the next year would have to look at him. The message reached Venice in weeks. It reached the Pope. It reached Genoa. And finally, the message landed. This was not a teenager performing diplomatic theater. This was a sultan preparing to take the city. Because what happened next is the source of one of the most stubborn myths about the fall of Constantinople. Here we should pause for a moment. You will often hear that the West simply abandoned the city, that the Pope ignored the desperate Byzantine pleas, that Venice and Genoa, calculating their profits, decided the dying empire was no longer worth saving. That isn't quite what happened. The Pope did try to send funds. Venice and Genoa did mobilize relief fleets. The Holy Roman Emperor sent letters. Ships were actually rigged. Money was actually raised. What killed Constantinople in the end was not Western indifference. It was something worse. It was coordination failure. The Venetians distrusted the Genoese, who distrusted the Venetians right back. The Pope wanted full church union as the price of aid. The Byzantine clergy still said they preferred a Turkish sultan to a Roman pope. The winds in the Aegean turned bad in the spring. Decisions made in council chambers in Rome and Venice took months to become ships. Ships took weeks to cross the Mediterranean. And by the time relief expeditions actually started moving in the spring of 1453, they were already 3 months behind. The fleets were at sea when the city fell. One Western soldier, though, did get there in time. In late January 1453, a Genoese mercenary captain sailed into the Golden Horn, the protected harbor that runs along the northern side of the city, with 700 professional soldiers and the full battle gear of a Renaissance siege specialist. His name was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, and he had the best resume in the Mediterranean. Giustiniani was not there for ideology. He was there for a contract. Constantine had promised him personal rule of the Aegean island of Lemnos if they won. He was a soldier of fortune, and he was the only experienced siege commander in the city. The Byzantines themselves had not fought a major war in living memory. Most of the men available to stand on the walls were civilians, shopkeepers, monks, sailors, and the city's tiny professional guard. Constantine handed Giustiniani command of the central section of the land walls, the section everyone knew would be the focus of any Ottoman assault. For a few weeks, the city even felt something close to hope. That ended on April 6, 1453. On the morning of April 6th, the Ottoman army arrived at the walls. Eyewitnesses described it as a city growing where no city had been the day before. Tents stretching in concentric rings, banners, baggage trains, artillery, parks, herds of horses. The total Ottoman force, by the best modern estimates, was somewhere between 60 and 80,000 regular troops, plus tens of thousands of irregular auxiliaries, engineers, cooks, and animal handlers. The total was very likely above 100,000 human beings camped outside a city defended by at most 8,000. 8,000, defending 14 miles of wall. To give you the scale, that is, fewer soldiers than a single modern military division being asked to hold a perimeter the size of the island of Manhattan. When Constantine and Giustiniani made the final count of who was actually willing to stand on a wall and fight, they had to make a decision they hid from everyone except themselves. The number was so bad that they agreed to keep it secret even from their own population. They knew that if the real numbers got out, civilian morale would collapse before the first shot was fired. The siege had begun. The Roman Empire had one man against 10 or more on every stretch of wall. The only experienced commander in Constantinople was a Genoese contractor whose deal was, if we win, you give me an island. And the man at the top, the man who had refused to flee, refused to surrender, and refused even to let his own people know how badly outnumbered they were, was about to discover that the wall he had bet his empire on had just become obsolete. The reason reason the wall was about to become obsolete was a man named Orban. Orban was a Hungarian engineer, a specialist in casting bronze artillery, a craftsman, not a soldier. About a year before the siege began, he had walked into Constantinople and offered Constantine the most advanced cannon design in the world. He named his price. Constantine could not pay it. The Byzantine treasury was empty. So Orban walked out of Constantinople, crossed the Bosphorus, and offered the same design to Mehmed II. Mehmed paid him 4 times what he had asked from Constantine. He also gave him an unlimited budget, all the bronze he wanted, and a target. The result was the largest cannon ever built up to that point in human history. The Byzantines called it the Basilica. It was 27 feet long. It fired stone balls weighing 1,500 pounds, roughly the kinetic equivalent of throwing a modern compact car at a wall once or twice a day. It took 60 oxen to move it. It overheated so badly between shots that it could only fire about 7 times in a 24-hour cycle. And every time it fired, the recoil knocked the gun off its mount and required hours of work to reposition. It also worked. On April 12, 1453, the Basilica began firing on the Theodosian Walls. A 1,000-year-old defensive system, the most successful fortification in the medieval world, was now being hit, day after day, with a force its builders could never have imagined. Limestone cracked, brickwork sheared. Whole sections of the outer wall collapsed in piles. The defenders worked at night, repairing what they could with rubble, timber, and packed earth. By morning, the cannon would start hitting again. The rubble would fall again. The math was simple and brutal. The wall was being eaten faster than it could be repaired. The clock was now running against Constantinople in a way it had never been running before. This is the moment most historians point to when they say the medieval world ended. Not the day the walls came down. The day artillery proved it could break them. Then, for one strange week in mid-April, it looked like the math might shift. On April 20th, 4 ships appeared on the southern horizon. 3 were Genoese galleons, carrying food, weapons, and reinforcements. The 4th was a Byzantine transport carrying grain from Sicily. They were sailing for the Golden Horn. They were also sailing directly into an Ottoman naval blockade that outnumbered them by roughly 100 to 1. The battle that followed was watched by both armies from the shore. Mehmed personally rode his horse into the surf to scream orders at his admiral. The Ottoman ships swarmed the 4 Christian vessels, and for hours, in front of the Sultan and his entire army, they could not stop them. Higher freeboards, better cannon platforms, veteran Genoese crews who had fought sea battles all over the Mediterranean. The 4 ships punched through the blockade and slipped into the safety of the Golden Horn, where the Byzantine boats welcomed them in, and the chain across the harbor was raised behind them. For a few days, the city believed the West was coming after all. Mehmed, watching this from his horse, was incandescent. By some accounts, he tore his clothes in rage. His admiral was beaten publicly in front of the army and stripped of his command. And the next morning, the Sultan walked into his command tent and gave his engineers an instruction that should not have been possible. Move the fleet over the hill. The geography of Constantinople is what makes this strange. The city sits on a triangular peninsula. To the south is the Sea of Marmara. To the north is the Golden Horn, the natural harbor that runs along the city's flank, which the Byzantines had sealed off with a massive iron chain stretched across its mouth. Inside the Golden Horn, the city was safe from naval attack. The chain held. The harbor walls along the inside were thinner, lighter, and lightly defended because there had never been any reason to defend them. Nothing could get inside, unless you moved your fleet over the hill. Behind the Ottoman camp on the European shore, there is a ridge of land about 200 feet high that separates the Bosphorus from the Golden Horn. Mehmed's order was to build a road over that ridge, a road of greased timber rollers, and to haul 70 warships overland from the Bosphorus down into the harbor on the other side. On the morning of April 22nd, under the cover of his artillery, the Ottoman fleet rolled over the hill on logs and dropped one by one into the Golden Horn behind Byzantine lines. by dawn. The Byzantine defenders looked north and saw enemy warships floating in the harbor that had been safe for 1,000 years. The consequence was immediate. The Byzantines now had to defend the seawalls along the Golden Horn, on top of 14 miles of wall on the landward side. They did not have the men. Troops had to be pulled away from the main land walls, the place the main assault was actually coming from, to defend a flank that had suddenly stopped being safe. Giustiniani's already thin defense got thinner. The siege then settled into the rhythm that all sieges eventually settle into. The cannon fired by day. The defenders repaired by night. Engineers on both sides tunneled under the walls trying to set off mines. Counter-tunnelers fought each other underground in the dark with knives and spears. Soldiers on the walls slept in their armor. Civilians inside the city watched the food stores shrink and the prices double, then triple, then stop being prices at all because nobody had anything left to trade. The most striking eyewitness inside the walls was a Venetian ship's surgeon named Niccolò Barbaro, who kept a daily diary that survives to this day. Barbaro is not a romantic. He is a doctor with a quill. He records casualty counts, weather prices the mood of the men around him. If you read his diary forward through April and into May, you can watch the city run out of hope in slow motion. The entries get shorter. The sentences get blunter. Everyone by that point has quietly stopped expecting to live. And then the eclipse happened. On the night of May 24th, 1453, the moon over Constantinople went dark. A total lunar eclipse passed over the city. In any other century, this would have been an unremarkable astronomical event. In Constantinople, in May 1453, it was something close to a death sentence, because every Byzantine alive had grown up hearing the prophecy that Constantinople would never fall while the moon was full and bright. The fall the prophecy said would come when the moon was hidden. That night, the moon was hidden. In churches across the city, civilians fell to the floor. Whatever belief had been holding the population together started to break. The next day, the chronicles say, the most sacred icon in Constantinople, an icon of the Virgin Mary that supposedly went back to the Apostle Luke, was carried out in procession to rally the people. Partway through, the icon slipped off its bearers and fell into the mud. They lifted it back up. It happened again. Then, a sudden storm broke over the procession, with rain so heavy that the bearers had to stop entirely. By the morning of May 25th, the civilian population of Constantinople had effectively concluded that God had withdrawn from their city. In the Ottoman camp that same week, Mehmed sat down with his Grand Vizier and made the most counterintuitive decision of the entire siege. He offered Constantine a deal. The Grand Vizier's name was Halil Pasha. He was the most senior official in the Ottoman government, the conservative old voice who had served Mehmed's father, and who had been quietly trying to talk Mehmed out of this entire siege for over a year. Halil's argument was simple and reasonable. Constantinople had never been taken by land. Every previous Ottoman attempt had failed. The longer the siege dragged on, the more likely it was that a Western relief fleet would actually arrive. And if the army was caught between the walls and a Christian relief force, the Sultan himself could be killed, and the dynasty could be destroyed. Better to negotiate. Better to walk away with something than risk everything. So Mehmed sent a delegation to Constantine, offering a final compromise. Hand over the city, walk out alive. Keep your imperial title. Take rule of the Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece, the last meaningful chunk of Byzantine territory left, then governed by Constantine's own brothers. The population would be spared the standard 3 days of pillage. Specifically, no enslavement, no sacking, no general killing. Constantine sent back the answer that survives in the historical record. To surrender the city to you, he wrote, is beyond my authority or anyone else's who lives in it. For we have all, by common resolve, agreed to die of our own free will, without saving our lives. This is the line historians keep returning to, because, read closely, it does not actually say no. It does not refuse Mehmed personally. It says something stranger, that the emperor, the man at the top of a 1,500-year imperial system, does not have the authority to surrender the city. The Byzantine historian Jonathan Harris has argued that this single line is the key to Constantine's entire decision. He was not making a tactical calculation. He was not weighing odds. He was articulating a position that, by the logic of his office, was not really his to bargain away. He was the last man in a line that ran back to Augustus. Roman emperors do not surrender Rome. The historian Anthony Caldelis goes one step further. He points out that we have to remember the Byzantines did not call themselves Byzantines. That word was invented by later European historians to politely cordon off the medieval Greek-speaking empire from the real Roman one. Constantine and his court called themselves Romaioi, Romans. To them, this was not the end of Byzantium, which would have been a strange foreign word they did not use. This was the destruction of the Roman Empire. The political body of which Constantine was, on May 28, 1453, the sole surviving head. You do not sell that for a province. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed called his final council of war on May 26th. Halil Pasha argued one last time for lifting the siege. The relief fleet rumor was still circulating through the army. Soldiers were tired. The cannon's foundry was wearing out. The young hawks around Mehmed argued the opposite. One more assault. A massive, all-in, every soldier on the walls assault. If it failed, they would lift the siege the next morning. If it succeeded, they took the red apple. Mehmed sided with the hawks. The date of the final assault was set for the morning of May 29th, inside Constantinople. The last full day of the empire was May 28th. Word had gone through the city the day before that an attack was coming at dawn. The defenders had finished what repairs they could. The civilians had finished what hiding they could. And the priests, for the first time in 400 years, agreed to do something none of them had wanted to do. That night, in the Hagia Sophia, Orthodox and Catholic clergy held a unified Christian Mass together. For 400 years, the schism between Rome and Constantinople had been the defining wound of Christian Europe. Orthodox priests had refused to set foot in the Hagia Sophia ever since the union with Rome had been declared. Catholic and Orthodox congregations had not taken communion at the same altar in living memory. Constantine's own population had hated his religious union with Rome more than they hated the Ottomans. On the night of May 28th, all of that ended. Orthodox priests stood at the altar with Latin priests. Constantine took communion publicly with his soldiers around him. He walked through the church afterward, asking forgiveness from anyone he might ever have wronged. The Genoese stood with the Greeks. Sailors stood with monks. Aristocrats stood with shopkeepers. Niccolo Barbaro, the Venetian surgeon, recorded that grown soldiers wept openly during the service. When the Mass was over, every man who was going to fight walked out of the Hagia Sophia and went to his post on the walls. Constantine went to his command position above the central gate, where Giustiniani's section of the line was the most damaged. He spent the rest of the night going up and down the walls in the dark, speaking to his soldiers individually. According to the chronicles, he stopped at each section, named the commander, and thanked them by name. Around 3 in the morning, the wind shifted. The Ottoman cannon, which had been quiet for several hours, started firing again. The final assault was beginning. The first wave came at the most damaged section of the wall, just before dawn. Mehmed sent his irregulars first. The Bashi bazooks, volunteer fighters, often poorly equipped, drawn from across the Ottoman world by the promise of plunder. They were not his elite. They were his stress test. Their job was to die in the breach for a few hours, exhaust the defenders, run them out of arrows and ammunition, and tire their sword arms. Behind them, in disciplined rows in the dark, waited the second wave, the regular Anatolian troops. The Bashi bazooks attacked for about 2 hours. They were thrown back. They were killed in piles in the moat and the ditches. They did exactly what Mehmed had sent them to do, which was to soak up Byzantine ammunition. The second wave hit at first light. The Anatolian regulars were trained soldiers. They came over the broken stones in disciplined ranks, climbed the rubble of the outer wall, and were thrown back again, but only just. Giustiniani's men were tiring. Constantine was personally fighting on the wall by this point, sword drawn, in the same section as the Genoese. The Anatolians retreated. The defenders had now been fighting for nearly 4 hours without sleep, on top of weeks of attrition. Then, Mehmed sent his Janissaries. The Janissaries were the elite professional infantry of the Ottoman Empire, slave soldiers raised from childhood for one purpose: the best trained, best disciplined, best paid heavy infantry in the Mediterranean world. The Sultan personally led them down to the moat and gave them an order to attack. This was the wave that broke the city. But it did not break it the way the legends say. You will sometimes hear that Constantinople fell because of a small gate. The story goes that a tiny postern gate in the wall, called the Cercoporta, had been left unlocked by careless defenders, and that a handful of Janissaries slipped through it, climbed onto the inner wall, raised an Ottoman banner, and started the panic that brought the whole line down. There is a thin grain of truth in this. A small breach did happen at the Cercoporta. A few Janissaries did get through it. An Ottoman flag did go up. But that was not why the city fell. The city fell because something else happened, almost at the same time, about a quarter mile to the south. In the middle of the Janissary assault, a projectile hit Giovanni Giustiniani. The accounts disagree about what hit him. A crossbow bolt, a piece of shrapnel, a small lead ball. What they agree on is that it pierced his armor and went into him deeply. He started bleeding badly. He was conscious. He was in pain. And he made the decision that by some accounts ended the Roman Empire. He told his men to carry him off the wall. Constantine was a few yards away. Constantine begged him to stay. He knew exactly what would happen the moment the Genoese soldiers saw their commander being carried away. "Stay on the wall," he said. "Even if you cannot fight, just be visible." Giustiniani refused. He had his men carry him down through the gate, behind the wall, toward the harbor, toward his ship. He was, in the most basic sense, going home. The instant the Genoese saw him go, the line came apart. This is the part the chronicles agree on. Some of his men followed him toward the harbor. Others, watching the gate behind them stand open for the wounded commander, simply walked off their posts. Within minutes, a section of the central land wall, the most defended section, the section everyone had been focused on for weeks, was empty. The Janissaries surged into the gap. This is what actually brought Constantinople down. Not a forgotten gate. Not careless defenders. A wounded mercenary captain who decided he was done. By the time the Janissaries cleared the inner wall and started spreading along the parapets, the Byzantine line was no longer a line. It was knots of men fighting in place, surrounded. Constantine was still on the wall. What he did next is the part that becomes in every later retelling, the founding image of the legend. The accounts we have were written by men who were not there at the exact moment, by his secretary who survived but was elsewhere, and by chroniclers who reconstructed the scene from survivors years afterward. The historian Marios Philippides has spent his career arguing that we should be very careful about treating these accounts as eyewitness reporting. The emperor's death, he writes, is one of the most heavily mythologized moments in late medieval history. The real story is almost certainly more chaotic, more anonymous, and less cinematic than the version that got written down. What the chronicles say is this. When Constantine realized the line was lost, that the Janissaries were inside the city, that there was no rallying the Genoese, that no counterattack was going to retake the wall, he stopped. He stripped off his imperial cloak, the purple robe with the imperial eagles embroidered on the shoulders, the sash, the boots that marked him as the Roman emperor. Whatever marked him as someone worth ransoming, worth identifying, worth pulling out alive, he discarded. He drew his sword. 2 men were with him. One was his cousin Theophilos. The other was a Spanish knight named Don Francisco of Toledo, who had come east years earlier to fight for Christendom, and had stayed in the city because he believed in the cause more than the Byzantines themselves did. The 3 of them charged into the Janissaries together, and then the historical record ends. We do not know what happened next. None of the men who charged with him survived. there was no one to write it down. By the time the city was secure and the Sultan's officials started compiling reports, Constantine was a missing person. They could not find him. They went looking for the imperial body. They could not find it. By stripping off his insignia, Constantine had made certain that nobody would. There is a story, and you should hear it as a story, that Mehmed had a body brought to him in the afternoon and identified it as the emperor by the boot's purple leather, embroidered with golden eagles, the kind only the Roman emperor could wear. The story says the head was cut off and displayed in the city. Some versions say it was sent to other Muslim capitals as proof of the conquest. The story has been told for 5 centuries. It is almost certainly not true. There is no eyewitness to Constantine's death. There is no contemporary report that confirms his body was found. The most thorough modern scholarship concludes that the body presented to Mehmed was very likely a misidentified corpse, produced under enormous pressure to give the Sultan the proof he needed for political reasons. The actual emperor probably died anonymously somewhere in the chaos along the broken wall, his body lost in the mud and the bodies of the men around him. The last Roman emperor has no tomb, no shrine, no grave anyone can point to. This silence has had a long life of its own. Within a few generations, Greek folk culture had filled the silence with a legend that survives in the Greek-speaking world to this day. The legend says that at the last possible second, an angel of God descended over the breach. The angel rescued Constantine. The angel turned the emperor to white marble. And the angel hid the marble emperor in a cave beneath the golden gate of the city, where he is sleeping, waiting for the day when he will wake up, take back his sword, and reclaim the city for Rome. They call him the Marble Emperor, Marmaromenos Vasilias. It is not a serious historical theory. It is not meant to be. It is what a culture does when it cannot accept that its last emperor died in the dirt without a body. The legend gives him a tomb that no one can desecrate, and an ending that no one can finish. Inside the city that morning, the legend was already being rehearsed by everyone else. As Janissaries spread through the streets, civilians ran for the Hagia Sophia. They believed something specific. They believed an old prophecy that said the Turks would only ever conquer the city up to the great square in front of the cathedral, and that at that exact threshold, an angel of fire would descend from heaven and strike the invaders down. Thousands of people locked themselves inside the church. They locked the heavy bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia behind them. They waited for the angel. No angel came. The Janissaries reached the square. They reached the doors. They broke the doors down with axes. What they found inside was not the angel of fire. It was an unarmed civilian population, old men, women, children, priests, monks, the wealthiest and the poorest of the city, kneeling in prayer in the largest cathedral in the world. The accounts of what followed are difficult to read, even at a distance of nearly 600 years. The Ottoman troops were operating under the standard rules of war for a city that had refused surrender. 3 days of pillage permitted. They sorted the population. The old and infirm were killed where they stood. The young and able were tied together with their own clothing and let out as slaves. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of the Christian world, became a holding pen for the Christian population of Constantinople, awaiting transport to the slave markets. Mehmed himself entered the city in the afternoon. He rode his horse through the broken central wall, through streets where the bodies were still being cleared, and made directly for the Hagia Sophia. At the steps of the cathedral, he dismounted. He picked up a handful of dust from the ground. He sprinkled it over his own turban in an old gesture of humility before God, and he walked through the broken doors into the church. When he stood under the dome, by all accounts, even the Sultan paused. The Hagia Sophia was the largest interior space in the medieval world. Sunlight came through the high windows. The mosaics of Christ Pantocrator looked down. Mehmed had been raised to take this city since he was a boy. He had spent his entire reign preparing for the moment he was standing in. According to the Ottoman chroniclers, the first thing he ordered was for the cathedral to be cleared, washed, and prepared for the call to prayer. By sunset on May 29, 1453, the first muezzin's voice was echoing up into the dome, where for 900 years, the Patriarch of Constantinople had crowned Roman emperors. The bells of Constantinople stopped ringing. They have not rung in the Hagia Sophia since. This is the moment historians point to when they talk about the end of the medieval world. Not the breach, not the death of the emperor, the change of the call. The instant the Christian liturgy ended in that building, and the Islamic one began, 1,500 years of unbroken Roman political continuity stopped. And the consequences ran very fast. The first was geopolitical. The Ottoman Empire, which Western observers just a year earlier had been dismissing as a regional power led by an inexperienced teenager, now controlled the most important real estate on the planet. The narrow waterway between Europe and Asia, the hinge of the world. Mehmed moved his capital to Constantinople almost immediately. Within a generation, his successors would push into the Balkans, take Egypt, take Mecca, and reach the gates of Vienna. The map of the next 400 years of European history was redrawn on May 29th. The second consequence was economic. For 1,000 years, the overland trade routes from Europe to Asia, the silk routes, the spice routes, the gold routes had run through Constantinople. After 1453, those routes were no longer reliable for Christian traders. The cost of doing business with Asia went up. The Italian merchant republics started losing money. And so, within 40 years of the fall of Constantinople, kings in Portugal and Spain were funding desperate, half-mad expeditions looking for an alternate route to the east. One of those expeditions in 1492 would accidentally find a hemisphere nobody in Europe had known existed. The historians who study this period have a phrase for it. They say the Age of Discovery did not start in Lisbon or Madrid. It started in the breach at the central walls of Constantinople on the morning of May 29, 1453. That, ultimately, is why Constantine's choice on that night matters. Not because of the romance of the final charge, not because of the legend, because of what his refusal meant for the next 500 years. Constantine could have surrendered. He could have left for an Italian villa on the Genoese ships. He could have signed Mehmed's offer and saved his population from the massacre that followed. The case for any of those is a reasonable, rational case. A modern political leader facing those odds would almost certainly take the deal. He did not take the deal. He told the Sultan in writing that he did not have the authority to give the city away because everyone in it had decided to die. And then he stripped the marks of his office off his own body, so that no one would be able to identify what he had been, and walked into the dark. You can read that as fanaticism. You can read it as suicide. You can read it as the last man in a 1,500-year political tradition refusing to be the one who finally breaks the chain. The historians who have spent careers on it tend to read it the third way. Jonathan Harris argues that Constantine understood something specific about his office. Roman emperors do not negotiate the survival of Rome. The empire ends when the last one falls, not before. He made sure he was the last one to fall. Which brings us back to where we started. To a man standing on the walls of his city in the pre-dawn dark of May 29th, looking at 60,000 torches, with multiple clean exits behind him and a written offer in his hand. We started by asking why he did not take any of them. The answer the historical record gives us is not very satisfying. The answer is that the office did not belong to him. The office was a relay 1,500 years long, and he was the last runner. He could not stop running. And the answer to what happened to him is in the end even less satisfying than that, because there is not one. He stripped off the things that would have made him recognizable. He charged into a wave of soldiers who could not be counted. And the last Roman emperor became a man with no body, no tomb, no grave, and no end that anyone can confirm. In a way, that is the most fitting ending an empire that old could ask for. The Roman Empire did not surrender. The Roman Empire did not abdicate. It is not technically on the historical record as having ended at all. It simply walked into the breach one morning in May, stopped being visible, and was never seen again. somewhere under the streets of modern Istanbul, beneath the foundations of buildings that have been rebuilt many times since 1453. The body of the last emperor of the Romans is probably still there, unmarked, unrecognized, mixed in with the bones of the men who died next to him. And if you believe the old story, the one the Greek-speaking world has been telling for nearly 600 years now, he is not dead at all. He is sleeping in a cave under the Golden Gate, turned to marble by an angel, waiting for the morning when someone wakes him up. He is still waiting.